screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Hmm. So last week we were in Amsterdam and in the Netherlands, and we were talking about two movements that happened almost parallelly in that country. Of course, the one second, yeah, that all that which was of course the what was called the Amsterdam School and the Style. We are going to look at a similar sort of bifurcation of interests that also happens in Germany in what is called the Weimar period. I'll tell you what the Weimar period is as we are going through this lecture. And we are going to split it over two classes, hopefully two, if you manage to finish the expressionists today. I think in my excitement, I just might have added too many things. But we'll be looking at the expressionists today, and next week we'll be looking at the what are called the new objectivists, or out of which we shall be looking at the Bauhaus. But before we go a little further, if you guys remember some like these two characters from our lectures in the last semester, we had these two particularly modern sort of subjects that were created by the late 19th century. The first was the idea of the dandy, or if you remember, we had really spoken of Oscar Wilde, who thought the entire world is about artifice and everything is about, is about kind of the loving the artifice of the world. And we saw the Art Nouveau movement through the lens of the dandy. And then there was the other, which is the idea of the Renault. Renault is somebody who is kind of is detached from the world and is only observing the world as this amazingly kind of strange place. So he doesn't have a direct kind of intimate relationship with it, but is rather has a kind of sense of detachment from it. And he sees the world as art. And we saw Charles Baudelaire at that point to think about. And these are the kinds of artists that we saw when we were thinking about both of these. The flaneur sees the world as an artwork. These are, of course, the impressionists that were making art at that time. And for the dandy, we saw the work of the Vienna Secession, and we looked at the Beethoven Klimt, Beethoven frieze and in the Secession building in Vienna. Today, the modern character that we'll be looking at is one that is called the romantic. And when we often think of the idea of the romantic, we usually connect it with the idea of romantic love, or the love that, a sort of a particular kind of Romeo and Juliet kind of love. That's what we call a romance, right? But actually, the word romantic means something far different. It's a movement. Romanticism is a movement that happened in the late 18th century, which really was looking at the idea of the human subject in the world being, so inspired by the world around and that entire kind of immensity of the universe, and the idea that you exist in it and you are able to, in many ways, relate to that sort of turmoil of the world. That's really what the romantic subject really is about. And this painting is very famous. It's called Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. Believe we've seen it before as well in some of the earlier presentations. And it is this kind of character, this person who's in touch with nature and who's in touch with himself, and somehow his body is really only a vehicle through which him and nature become one, that is seen as the idea of the romantic. You see in particularly this movement, this romantic movement in Germany at a particular time. And you have these terms that are that are emerging in Germany at that time. This, for example, is Sturm und Drang. I don't speak German, so I'm going to mispronounce everything, but nevertheless. But it's called Storm and Drive, effectively saying that, this is a movement that is celebrating, like, look at that painting, clouds in the sky and light coming in and these ships being torn by the wind and lightning in the sky. So there is a turmoil in the air, and that is really what we are celebrating in the world. It is not a detached view of nature. It's a more, I guess, inhabited and a more visceral, bodily kind of relationship with nature. You have authors like Goethe, who becomes really, really one of the most important German writers ever, who writes poetry and prose, etc., that are also extremely romantic in nature. I'm going to show you, just talk about two of these. One is the German version of Devdas, almost. Is this book that was written by him that was called The Sorrows of Young Werther, in which this guy is so much and deeply in love with this woman that finally at the end he kills himself. That kind of romanticism. I think Bengalis also have a certain kind of romanticism very much deeply embedded in that Devdas story. I could never understand what's so great about the Devdas character. He just seems like a jerk. Anyway, that's not for me to say. I might be hurting the sentiments of Vidisha in the audience right now. But then you have the other incredible book that he comes up with. It's a book that is called Faust. And this word Faust becomes really embedded in the imagination of the modern. So Faust is a very interesting story, and I would recommend you to really think about that, especially when it comes to architects. Faust is a doctor, or he's an intellectual doctor like us, like professionals, right? Who really wants to do good things or whatever. And for that, he makes a deal with the devil. Okay, and I mean, I'm only because in every version of Faust, the character and the deal changes. Okay, but one thing is for certain, he always makes a deal with the devil, and the deal with the devil is that you can do anything you like, but you have to sell your soul to me. And I keep thinking about architects very often when one thinks about that, that particularly tragic imagination that to be able to achieve good, you have to actually sell your soul to those in power. And it seems Faust seems to represent that. I keep thinking about, the Central Vista project, for example, as one of those examples, or the waterfront projects that we very often have. The other thing that is also happening in Germany is that you have Nietzsche, who's talking about this imagination, what is called the Übermensch, the Superman. Okay, and the Superman is imagined as someone who has gone beyond conventional morality, who has developed a morality of it by himself. And just look at his description. The Übermensch is represented metaphorically as, and this is in the book, he says that he's lightning that is portended by the silence and raindrops of a traveling storm cloud, the sun's rise and culmination at its midday zenith. So you see the way that nature and man are seen as this one thing, like man is actually a force of nature. So this particular sort of, um, how should I put it, romantic relationship with nature is something that really is very much at the heart of the movement that we're going to be talking about, which is that of German expressionism. And that word is important, expressionism. Okay, and we'll come to that word later on as well. But what's happening in Germany is that Germany has very recently been unified. In 1866 to 60 to 71, all these different sorts of states actually came together under the idea of Germany, which is a much larger state. And it is in that time that all of these ideas are actually coming together. But the time that we are really are going to be looking at is one which is it's called the Weimar Republic, Weimar Republic. And this is really the time between the wars. As you all know, Germany lost the First World War and of course went to war in 1929. And that was actually the period in which Germany became the center for intellectual, incredible intellectual flourishing happened in that period in Germany. So it's an important thing to think about, that what the trauma of war really did to Germany. Because what the First World War had left Germany with was an incredible sense of humiliation. This, of course, is the Treaty of Versailles, where entire parts of Germany were then distributed among the winning powers. Okay, and Germany had just been through one of the worst and the most devastating annihilations that had happened. That they could remember, that the world had seen, with the war itself, with the trenches and the deaths and the destruction that had happened, because millions of people had died. And in post-war Germany, if a perpetrator had to be kind of identified of this humiliation, it was imagined that it was the Jew. So you have this entire period of time when there is a growing anti-Semitism, very much in the media, in everyday life. There is an entire rhetoric of targeting the Jews as being the reason why they lost, because the Jews stabbed the army in the back, as this 1919 cartoon in a newspaper would illustrate. Yeah. So, and at the same time, Berlin becomes the center through which where all of these activities are coming through. So Berlin starts becoming, like Vienna and Paris earlier, a real center for culture and of art. It becomes a place where intellectuals come, where philosophers come. It becomes a place where where sexuality and freedom become kind of the rampant, actually, and it becomes very, very attractive for lots of people who otherwise feel marginalized in their rural communities. They all come to Berlin, And then, and while this is happening, while Germany becomes a place for those who in many ways are seen as deviant and gives a place of shelter to them, becomes a place for artists and literature, etc., to flourish, you also have the idea of the ideal German body that is emerging as a mirror to this. And that, of course, is the imagination that the Nazis very often embrace. These are, for example, youth camps that are held. Also, if you think about it, in the similar sort of romantic imagination of the landscape. Naked bodies in nature, feeling one with the world. There is no boundary between me and nature, etc. And it's men and women and children. All of them are participating in these kind of celebrations of the ideal Germanic body. But in Berlin, there is a flourishing, like I said earlier, of some of the most important architecture, art, theater, philosophies that continue to affect us today. Okay, from Einstein as a scientist, in terms of philosophers, you have what is called the Frankfurt School, which we'll talk about later. Heidegger, you have kind of people like in all the musicians are happening. You have this great kind of sense of something remarkable is happening in Weimar, Germany. And that's happening in architecture too. Like I said earlier, two very important strands emerge from there that continue to affect us even today across the world. Yeah. What we'll be looking at really is we'll be looking at the first, which is German Expressionism. That's what we'll be looking at. And these are some of the events that we will keep getting back to when we are talking about it. So this is just a general sort of the Bridge, the Blue Rider are all groups of intellectuals that came together to really think about what art or architecture should be doing. Okay, and the Russian Revolution had just happened, or is in the process of happening, and you have it. Actually, the Great Depression is happening after that. So it's within that period, internationally, that you have this. That you have this entire thing that's coming together, right? Okay, let's go ahead. A painting that becomes very important for a painting or an artist that becomes really important for the German expressionists is this one. It's Edward. You all know this painting. It's one of the most world famous paintings. 1893. It's Munch, called The Scream. And if you read what he's saying, see. One evening I was walking along a path and the city was on one side and the fjord below. I felt tired and ill. I stopped and looked out over the fjord. The sun was setting. I sensed a scream passing through nature. It seemed to me that I heard the scream. I painted this picture, painted the clouds as actual blood. The color shrieked. This became the scream. So this idea that you are like, that the world is literally on fire around you, like in turmoil, is actually what, and art in many ways is merely expressing that, expressing in the work itself, these movements, these turmoils. Think about the abstract Amsterdam School and the movement of those lines in those facades of those buildings. In Amsterdam, it's still very toned down. In the German form, it becomes very, very expressive. And we'll see that a little further down. But for the other part of the story, I'm going to kind of go somewhere else. And it's a strange story. And it's a story that I discovered while I was putting together these lectures. The strange thing what happened is that you have this woman. No, this is a kind of weird story. Okay, so this woman, her name is Madame Blavatsky. She is not German. She happened to be Russian. Okay. She was in Russia, okay, and one day she was in a bad marriage, so she suddenly decided to go to Tibet. So she went to Tibet and was trained. Suppose these are all stories. We don't know how much of them is true and how much of them is not, but this is the story. The story is that she went to Tibet and studied Mahayana Buddhism and was highly influenced by Indian philosophy. Okay. She takes this idea of being highly influenced by Indian philosophy and travels to America. And in America, she starts what is called the Theosophical Society. Okay, the Theosophical Society, which claims that it is in touch with the spirits of the world. That she's a medium through which one can talk to the others and to the unseen forces of nature and the world and all of that stuff. She becomes highly influential in America, influences people like Thomas Edison and many other people. She comes to India and has a conversation with Dayanand Saraswati from the Arya Samaj to start a Theosophical Society in India, and it does happen. It lasts only for a short time, but of course later on it gets established in a much stronger way. She then moves to London. The reason I'm telling you this story is this is where an interesting thing happens. She moves to London, and Dr. Annie Besant, whom you all might know from your history textbooks, who is also part of the Irish Home Rule, gets in touch with Madame Blavatsky and becomes highly influenced by Blavatsky, becomes interested in questions of the spirit and all of these things. And later on, she travels to India and establishes the Theosophical Society in India. That's another story. We will tell that later, and maybe we'll come back to it a little later on. But what's important is that Annie Besant, when she begins to head the Theosophical Society, writes this book. This book is called Thought Forms. Okay. Now, Thought Forms is written in 1901, in which she really is many ways she's really thinking about the relationship in color, form, and emotion. So what she's doing is that she's saying, well, like this particular pink is vague, pure affection. That particular pink is a definite affection. This is a radiating affection. She makes this book that is completely full of this stuff. Okay, however kind of weird it may seem to me personally, but this book becomes very influential for this man. This man is Vasily Kandinsky. Kandinsky becomes one of the most important expressionist painters of that time. Kandinsky becomes highly influenced by thought forms and then writes a book, writes an essay actually that's called Concerns of the Spiritual in Art. And in this imagination, there's this idea that within art, you can really express these deeper emotions. Blue and red and green represent something deeper. He also starts many sorts of groups that are starting. There's this group on the right side, which is called the Blue Rider. The Blue Rider, the name itself, I mean, this idea of the art and architecture collective that is coming together for a common agenda is really an important thing that happens all across the 20th century. I've been part of collectives too, and we have all been part. It's like a thing. I don't know what architects do. They are constantly making collectives to talk, right? But the Blue Rider becomes a really important sort of movement that is really setting out what expressionism is going to be about. There is a call to get rid of all these false surfaces and to really think about a romantic expression of art that comes from deep within an artist who has a deeper understanding of the world, and therefore, is in kind of, so his inner feelings need to come out into the art. And his paintings, this is a book called The Blue Rider. And it is felt that, all these civilized people can't do that. The only people who can really express what happens deeply within them are primitive cultures, folk artists, and children. So there is now this idea that in children and in folk and in primitive, one can get back to having a more close relationship with nature and more close relationship with what is truly human. I'm going to show you some paintings made by Kandinsky. This is one. Another. This is called Lyrical, and you can see the movement of the horse and the movement of the lines and the colors as these dabs of blue and red. These are again another painter, also who was very closely related with Kandinsky in starting the Blue Rider, is Franz Marc. And this is another painter by him. You can see the flat colors and those really kind of moving volumes of those horses. Yeah. And this is another painting by Franz Marc. This is called The Fate of the Animals. Yeah. And it's about like how animals are in some senses being slaughtered. So you're able to see them in turmoil. You see the horses, the pigs, the deer, all in turmoil, and all the shards of space. All that. It reminds me a little of the futurist paintings, but the futurists were interested in movement. These guys are interested in expressing violence. It's a sort of different kind of tone. Another person who's also kind of associated with it, whose paintings are rather different, is Paul Klee. Paul Klee and Kandinsky, we shall meet again next week when we are talking about Bauhaus, but I'll just show you some of the paintings that he's done. Because of course architects love Paul Klee because he works with surface and line and these really points and elements. This is a very famous painting done by him that we will visit maybe next year when we are talking about history, which is the Angelus Novus, or the Angel of History. Yeah. But there are some things that are that the expressionists are interested in, and we'll see that even in the architecture work that we'll kind of come upon later on. One is the interest in the natural, this idea that one should be naked in nature. There should be no sort of civilized interface between your body and nature. You should be one with it. And the people who are the primitive. So this idea that in primitive cultures there's happiness, in primitive cultures there is truth, in primitive cultures and their nakedness is where one can find oneself again. And automatically there is an idea about who one is. This is Egon Schiele's work, and the idea of the body itself, the naked body, like looking at oneself really in the mirror and thinking as to what is the nature of the self, what are we really, and therefore really confronting questions of sexuality, confronting questions of desire becomes an important part, as does the obsession with death. So you have the darker sides of the human psyche that are being explored by the expressionists. If you remember that lecture from last semester when we were discussing Freud, it's as if the id wants to express itself within the world. The innermost, whatever that you've concealed, whatever that you've repressed, is dying to be set free, and that needs to explode into the city, into the world. The other interest is, of course, the city itself. This is George Grosz and his painting called The Metropolis. You see the cascading colors, the red. This is Berlin, no? It's exciting, it's alive, and this idea that one needs to be able to express and capture that within the frame of the canvas. This is a funeral that is being held, and this is called Apocalyptic City. I put it there because Shirish knows why. The Apocalyptic City. Yeah, and Janelle also does actually. But now let's move to architecture and really look at some of the more important works that happened in this entire sort of urge, right? And some kind of characters who become very important to the whole thing. And this is a chart that we will move through across this entire thing. Just to give you a briefing about this. This is Annie Besant becoming the head of the Theosophical Society in 1908. She writes Thought Forms in 1901. The Bridge and the Blue Rider, those two expressionist movements, are happening in the pre-war period. Okay, they are happening in this period. This is the beginning of the First World War. Okay, and this is the end of the First World War. The entire yellow is what is the Weimar period that runs across. And then this is when Hitler comes to power in 1933 in Berlin, and the war ends in 1945. So this is the period that we'll be looking at. And all of these are different groups and things that happen across that time. But we'll start with the top left, which is the architect Bruno Taut. And Bruno Taut, and this is the building, which is the glass house, is what we will start off with. Okay, these are the works that we'll be seeing that Taut did across his entire career. 1914, the year of the beginning of the First World War. That is the year of one of the most famous pavilions built in this century, which is called the Glass House. Okay. It's a very tiny building, if you think about it. Okay. But it was built for one of those amazing things that was there, you know, an exhibition of work of architects, the Werkbund exhibition in 1914 in Cologne. And it's a building that actually celebrates glass as this new material that can in many ways become representative of a modern culture. There was a poet called Paul Scheerbart, and he wrote this book that was called Glass Architecture, in which he celebrated the idea of transparency and lightness that was about that glass really allowed to do. So these crystalline forms would be imagined, these crystalline ways in which modern people could live in the world. And the building itself wants to celebrate that kind of crystalline nature. This is the plan of the building. It's a straightforward symmetrical plan. You come up at the center, there are staircases that take you up, and there is a cascading waterfall that runs along the sides. It's a very simple section. You come inside, you go up, and this is like a cascading water that kind of comes down, and it's covered with a glass dome. And there's tile work, colored tiles everywhere. There are projections happening. This is the interior, and that's the center of the dome, and light is supposed to come in. So it's this dazzling sort of kaleidoscopic interior is imagined as the place that the modern person can live in. And this idea of the crystalline house or the crystalline architecture, the obsession with glass as a representation of the modern, is of course something that you will find much later on as well in the work of people like I don't know, Mies van der Rohe, and that obsession with glass as something that represents modernity because of its crystalline nature is even something that you see today in the work of so many architects that we kind of look at within our architecture magazines. The second project is this, which is actually a book that he wrote called The City Crown. Another very important and interesting book. Look at the image on the cover. It is an Indian temple. So I think that there has been, I think, an unwritten history of the influence of kind of what was called Hindu and Indian sort of philosophy upon actually expressionism. And that is something that I would be very curious to follow through a little bit further. In the book, he talks about the fact that in ancient times, in older cities, there was always a building at the center that represented the value system of an entire culture. That is what he called the city crown. So in Mont Saint Michel is that church thingy, right? Or he proposed a kind of ideal city, like architects love to do. In this ideal city, he imagined that it would be a concentric city that would rise towards the center, and in the center would be what was called the city crown. And the city crown would be a building, or a mega building, in which it would not be secular and it would not be sacred, but it would be a place which would represent the value systems of this entire community. Really an interest in the idea of how architecture can represent a value system. And in his mind, of course, it was very closely linked to the idea of the glass pavilion, because the center would in many ways represent our highest and our most valuable sorts of aspirations. These are the city plans. You can see these cascading gardens on all sides, and at the center you have that tower, which is of course the city crown. In 1920s, he became part of like the housing kind of systems within Berlin, and at Berlin at that time was building workers housing, which is like Amsterdam was in the pre-war years. And one of his buildings is this one. It's the Horseshoe Estate. It's like that's what it is. It's a horseshoe. So you have a gateway. You have like a perimeter block that pretty much on the outside. You have these. Look at all the blocks around it, and you have this horseshoe at the center, and that's the building, this is the central garden. There is definitely an imagination of a good way of living in the city that is very much part of the way that he's thinking about it. A closer relationship with nature. That entire horseshoe, for example, contains a garden. And you have all these balconies that overlook the center. These are the interiors images just because I had them, and these are all the doors, etc. So there's a way in which every single home is also allowed to celebrate its own identity through the architectural elements that it uses. I'm very quickly just going to kind of breeze through a few images of his work of housing, and you'll see there's a lot of similarity that you'll find with the Bauhaus architecture, except that the Bauhaus architecture would probably not use this particular color green. And the interiors. One of the most amusing things I learned about Taut as I was working on this presentation was that this group that he was very much part of starting, which is called the Glass Chain. So what these guys did is, like a bunch of architects, these guys that you're seeing on the left, said that we need to talk about architecture, but we don't want to but we want it to seem as if no one knows who's saying things. So they made a group where they exchanged letters anonymously. So they gave each other names, like Bruno Taut's name was Glass. Hans Scharoun's name was Hans. And all of these guys kind of wrote these letters about architecture, etc., to each other. Okay, so this is what the Glass Chain effectively was. There was another group that also happened, in which also Bruno Taut was part of, and it was called The Ring. And this happened in Mies van der Rohe's office. So you can see there's a culture here of a lot of conversation, a lot of debate concerning what architecture is supposed to be. That happens because of that kind of strange period of the Weimar. What you're seeing in black are people we'll meet again, and what you're seeing red are people that we'll meet in this particular lecture itself. Ernst May, Hilbersheimer, Gropius, we'll meet them and we'll look at the next week and the week after that. Yeah. If you remember the Weissenhof Estate, do you guys remember I had spoken of this amazing exhibition that happened in Stuttgart in 1927, where all the architects built buildings. We'll come to that again, and Bruno Taut was one of them, except that all the other buildings in that entire exhibition were white, but Taut made a red or yellow building or something like that. I have only this black and white photograph of it. And Le Corbusier is reported to have explained, my God, Taut is colorblind because, you know, everything had to be white and clean. But Taut wasn't one who wanted to kind of make these kind of crystalline white boxes. What he was interested in was a celebration of the world with color and with form and with an expressionist sort of edge. One of the last works that he did is in Japan. It's a house. He moved out of Germany because of a variety of reasons. But this is literally like almost a year before, two before he died. It's a very simple room. But what is interesting here is that he is now being inspired by Japanese architecture. So it's as if even expressionism soaks in what it needs to express from that particular site and that particular context. It's very unlike the work that he's doing in Germany at that time. Here you see the very, very Japanese sort of aesthetic that is part of it, including the sliding screens, the wooden floors, the roof work, the beautiful patterns that are there on it, and of course the blood red seating that's there. But we now move to the next architect that we'll be looking at. And this is an architect. He's not really an architect. He's more of a teacher. You all know of you guys might have heard of the Waldorf system of education. It's this alternative mode of teaching. Tridha, I believe, in Andheri East is under the Waldorf school. And it was started by this man called Rudolf Steiner. And him is what we'll be looking at. And he did some architecture work as well. So we'll be looking at some of the architecture that he built. Yeah. But he again has a connection with this story. Madame Blavatsky and Annie Besant, because Rudolf Steiner in the early 1900s was a theosophist. He was very much enamored by Blavatsky's writings and felt that it had a lot to offer, our understanding of who we are in the world. But Blavatsky made Annie Besant in charge of the entire Theosophical Society, and Annie Besant went ahead and picked an Indian boy called J. Krishnamurti as the person who's going to be her successor. And that didn't go down particularly well with Rudolf Steiner. So what Steiner did is that he left. Steiner left and used a lot of like in 1902, he was the head of the Theosophical Society in Germany. And 1912, he leaves and starts what is called the Anthroposophical Society, based a lot upon the same ideas that emerged from the Theosophical Society. And naturally, since both of them were really interested in the idea of the self and treating the self as an expressive sort of being, you have a very similar imagination of expressionism that emerges even in his work. Okay. So in 1919, he starts his own kind of way of teaching, which is called, of course, Waldorf School, which spreads around the world. And there are many Waldorf schools all around the world, including Tridha, which started in Bombay in the year 2000. But this is that story, actually. Krishnamurti, etc., etc. You all can read all of that stuff later since you're going to have the presentation. Yeah. But what is interesting is that he builds builds this entire building that's called the Goetheneum. Goethe being the same Goethe that we saw in the beginning, who wrote Faust. And this is the model of the first Goetheneum. Even over here, you can see the fact that the building itself is bulbous. It is expressive of an internal sort of, it's as if there's an animal or something underneath it that is trying desperately to get rid of its architectural shell. This is a bird's eye view of that same. You see the domes and then there is a sort of organic attempt at making a building here. More images of the same building, and if you remember that term that we've been using over and over again, Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art. Every single thing around this was supposed to be is designed. It's a total work. When you're in the space, music and architecture and every painting is all part of one being. More images from that total work of art from within, except that what happens is that this building hardly lasts for a few years. And there's a fire and then the building comes down. So then a second Goetheneum is built. This time it's a little different. It's heavier and more muscular, and it is far more, and the walls themselves, it's using RCC walls themselves are sort of these kind of cavernous turning. It's the city crown. It's the city. It's Bruno Taut city crown, right? It rises above the city and it's supposed to represent the value systems of the whole community. Here is the entrance. I'm just going to show you a few images. The model, you see the plan, straightforward symmetrical plan, and this entire shell. The shell is the one that is folding, turning, twisting, molded, kind of like clay almost. The inside, celebration of form and color, uh, and 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 this is the building under construction. You see that stair that's like wildly going up in that space in between. Light coming in from above. This is the space as it exists now. Uh, Concrete expressing itself internally. No plaster. Look at this image with that man there and that entire cascading series of things. Yeah, it looks like a cavern, like a Piranesi. I don't know whether you know Piranesi, like a Piranesian drawing. I will show you Piranesi one day. Yeah. Even the buildings on the side have been designed in that mode. So this is another building that is also in many ways. This is, I think, a chimney house or something on the side that is also kind of taking on the forms of the main building. Yeah. Next on the list is Eric Mendelsohn. Part of the group, but one of the most important buildings that he designs is actually what is called the Einstein Tower. That is considered to be the icon of German Expressionism. So I could not leave Mendelssohn out. And this is the way he draws. I love these drawings, which are just like kind of these movement drawings. Now he's making it's really outside Berlin, not that much outside Berlin. But what's interesting is what he's saying here. He wants to represent energy through mass, right? So E equals mc squared, and this guy is trying to do that. He's trying to make this building energy, but through mass. It's called the Einstein Tower. So it's the way in which energy is supposed to move this material into this tower. That's the general idea. I'll show you images of this building. You see this, it's well, that's the building. I've never been there, but there's an observatory on top and a staircase that takes you up, a few offices on every floor. This is the entrance. This is the Einstein Tower. You see the basement and you see the way it's sitting on the ground. Nah? This entire tower kind of comes as if the ground is rising, cascading, folding, and kind of coming up into that dome that is sitting above the whole city. This is the plan, straightforward symmetrical plan. The staircase that is rising up across into the observatory. The sections, these are the offices on every floor, and the staircase is of course within the tower. Images of the interior. I love the section. You're able to see the whole thing as it's rising up into the dome. The seats, etc., are embedded. The tables are embedded within the walls itself. And this is the observatory on top, the staircase up to the observatory. You see how everything is kind of, how all the surfaces don't have hard edges. Everything is supposed to be folded as if one surface, like a snake, I don't know what kind of animal, has some skin-like thing has formed, and everything is cut out within that. It's something about his drawings that really make me think of him as an expressionist, because you're able to see these kind of easy, fluid movements of the way he wants his building to express itself. So these are some of the buildings that he's built. I'm not showing too many. There's department stores, and this like long shooting lines. This is what he built, I think, in Russia, the Red Banner Textile Factory. I think goes to Russia for a while, leaves, and then goes to America, if I'm not wrong. But I may be. After Mendelssohn, the next person we'll be looking at is a guy whom I absolutely find most fascinating. His name is Hans Poelzig. And Poelzig was part of all these groups. There was something called the November group. He was very much part of that. And he was in one of those early. I think he was part of the Ring as well. Now, Poelzig is he makes the most, maybe I like him because he also does a lot of film work, which I find very entertaining. One of the films that he had done, and actually because of his film work, he's also referenced in a much later Hollywood film called The Black Cat. And I'll just show you because I just found it funny. 1933, obviously it's a little later on, when Poelzig actually has left Germany and has gone somewhere else. In this, there's so this is a horror film in which the main villain is an architect called Poelzig. And is made by a friend of his. So that's the thing. And this is the building where that architect lives. You see that modernist building on top of the hill. This is the evil man's place. And this young man and his wife go to get stranded in a stormy night, and they end up living in that house. And then these are, of course, some of the dialogues. Is it to be wondered that you choose, once again, this place to build your house? A masterpiece of construction built upon the ruins of the masterpiece of destruction, because it is on a mass grave, the entire house. Yeah? The masterpiece of murder. The interior of the house is a modernist, expressionist modernist space. You see the black and white shadow. You know what chiaroscuro is? Chiaroscuro is like deep black and white shadows. Na? So the entire inside is full of these amazing black and white shadows on top, like an upper level that has all this glass and steel. And then there is a basement, and in the basement you have the most horrific things happening, all strange. You see all these shards, very, very expressionist sorts of kind of architectures that are there at the base of it. I love this little dialogue. So the guy Polzig is a great architect, and yes, one of the greatest. Well, I suppose we've got to have architects too. If I wanted to build a nice, cozy, unpretentious, insane asylum, he'd be the man for it, you know. And actually, if you look at Polzig's work, it is pretty scary. For example, this is one of his first works, a sulfuric acid factory in Germany, Luban. These are images of it. You can see just the images that seem like they are out of some sort of strange horror film, doesn't it? Like a heavy-handed sulfuric fire. It makes sulfuric acid, for God's sake, no? It's interesting to think that this building is being built at the same time as another. We'll show you next time. But like these are some more images of this very, very scary building, the sulfuric acid factory. That is built by Polzig. You can see the asymmetrical kind of these are the windows, the heaviness. So these guys are not heavy as against, let's say, Tout. These guys are not afraid of the weight. In fact, he's celebrating the weight. He's making the building seem much heavier. He's pulling it down to earth, making it kind of lugubrious, as the word is. And this strange profile that happens to the building as well. But for me, what's really kind of the thing about, okay, I'm not going to show this project, but for me, the most kind of important and the strangest project that he does is this one, which is actually, it's called the, I can't pronounce that. It's called the Gross Schauspiel House. Okay. Now, Max Reinhardt was a really important theater director in Berlin, like one of those like iconic theater directors, and he wanted a space to put to I guess show his work. So this is what Polzig does for him. Very simple box from the outside, but when you go in, it's got this, like, I don't know what this is, this ceiling, which has these stalactites that are just kind of coming down as if you're really kind of right within the cavern, no? That are all forming this sort of grotto within which this entire kind of plays, etc., are going to happen. And around, and these are colored, right? They're like colored with things. So this is the kind of lobby space, and look at that column, and it's light, and it's like on full drama, high drama architecture bana raha hai. There's no there's none of that sort of decorum that you find, let's say, in the Bauhaus, that form follows function. Yahan kuch nahi. This is like form follows madness. Like let the madness of the world, let the madness of being in the world just like express itself in these architectures. Huh? Because the plan is really simple. Like this is the plan of that building. Look at it. It's so simple, straightforward symmetry. You come inside your foyer, lobby. You come inside. Those are the damn strange columns. You come inside, and here's that mad, crazy cavern of shadows and of light. This is a view of the interior, another view of the interior. It's tremendous. I felt the space. Of course, this was demolished. It doesn't exist anymore. He goes ahead, and actually there are many more of these that he makes proposals for. These spaces where a community celebrates together. This is the Festspiel House in Salzburg, drawings of, never built. Another image, look at that drawing, just like the surfaces themselves are like becoming fire, I think, or water. These are all drawings that I got from the internet, so you have that stamp on them. Many such drawings exist. I'm not going to go through them, but strangely, another architect called Max Berg builds something called the Centennial Hall in a similar period in Germany, and this is the structural system. You see the kind of completely kind of these huge RCC arches that are holding up this roof that's throwing light in. That's the view from the outside. This is a view of the building as you're coming in. It reminded me so much of that of the Gross Spiegel House, or whatever you call it, that I thought it's important to show. I'm not going to go into many of his other work. I'm just going to show you some images of the drawings that he does for housing. This is his how this is a housing complex in Hamburg that he didn't design but drew. Another view of it. I'm just showing you because of the drawings, primarily because they're so. Look at the charcoal on that yellow paper. It's just like
Yeah, well, look at the housing, Rohan.
horrible. But who cares? Look at the drawing. But I think the idea of horror was all right for them. Like, that it's not meant to be pretty nice. If you're expressing yourself, you also have a darker side, so you should be allowed to do it. You know what I say? It's like this is his entry for the Palace of Soviets, 1931. Yeah. He also designed sets for films. Like this is the Golem. So in the Golem, which is another horror film, this is the sets that he designs. This is a story of a golem, a silent film. I love this little detail of that stair coming in. It could actually exist in that building by what's his name? That Rudolf Steiner's building. This is the village. This love of the medieval also pretty much is central to this. Look at the scales of things. The big door, the small door, the big latch. And this interior shot, which literally has the gross people houses ceiling within the building itself. Because really, this film is part of what really becomes one of the most important cinema movements of that time. German Expressionism is an important movement in film. And the iconic film of that time is this one. It's called The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and it concerns a mad doctor and a zombie and the works. Okay, story की जरूरत नहीं है, मैं वापस set सी दिखाने वाला हूँ तुम्हें. This reminded me of a drawing from, let's say, Bruno Taut's kind of, what is that book? The City Crown. This is the city, okay, that person is living in. This is the evil doctor. This is the evil doctor waking up the zombie. Look at the inside. All these diagonals, this completely crazy door. There is the house itself is distorted because of madness. And there's a love of that madness. This is the girl's room. It's so pretty with all the curtains and all. Bhansali would be proud. And of course, you have shadows and light that are playing a very large sort of kind of game in the creation of the feeling of horror. Yeah. More images from. I recommend watching the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari only for the sets and because of the high drama that it has. Yeah. But just thought you should know that such a thing existed. But now back to architecture, right? And the last architect. So we managed to fill in time. Not bad.
Yeah.
And the last architect that we'll be kind of looking at is, I think, one of my favorites, whose work actually I've seen only one of his works, to be honest. So in reality, so I'm a little like क्या बोलते वो besotted with that building, which is the last one we'll see. So this is Hans Scharoun. Hans Scharoun, of course, was part of the Ring. He was part of what was called the November Group. He was part of the Glass Chain. So he was really central to much of the thinking around the German Expressionists. But also he was younger and he had a much longer life. He died in 1972. Okay, so he had a long life and he built a lot of buildings. So we won't be looking at all of these. He was also part of the Stuttgart exhibition in Germany. So at 1920, the Weissenhof building, and this is his building there. As you can see, his building it's like a white building, but it has dashes of color. It has lots and lots of little expressionist touches, the swerve, the curve, the corner curve. All of these things do exist in that house. You see the plan itself with these two curves balancing each other out. Even inside, you have a curve for the toilets that gives the entire sort of building a movement. Even if you look at this railing, you see the railing doesn't turn normally, just this little hook and then it turns. Another building by him. This is a hostel for single people in Breslau, which is the same place as that anyway. So this is look at the plan. The plan again is not straight. It has got these really smooth and sensuous curves. This little curve here that then turns, becomes straight, then meets the central lobby space, and this guy just goes straight. But the joint between them is taken up by this lobby. And the lobby kind of, meets the ground. It swoops up, it turns, it comes in. There's this opening from here. You swoop up again and you go up. So there's this kind of movement that is that distorts that entire central piece. And of course, it also does it in the section and the elevation where these entire pieces are just hanging over you when you're entering the building. Yeah. Another image of the same building, and that's the central lobby space with the stilted area in the center. The next building that we'll be looking at is called the Schminke House, another kind of famous building, 1930 to 33, built, I guess, that time, pre-war. And here you are able to see the modernist influences. But you see, if you compare this with, let's say, a Corbusier building being built at the same time, Corbusier is being far more careful with the rectangle, while Sharoon is just using these planes as these floating planes, trying to remove horizontal walls entirely.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Corbusier is conservative, Rohan.
Oh, really? We shall come to Corbusier, then you shall see his conservatism. But you have, but there is a sort of kind of smoothness around here. No, there's like a playful movement. Look at the way that everything is sort of this fluid in the house, and in the plan is actually very simple. The plan is actually just a straightforward bar, but you see the curves just kind of meet out at the end to create these sorts of impressions. These are the plans. See, the plan is straight and it turns everywhere. This is a view of the interior. Another view of the house, and the plan, the wide area here, the toilets and the thing being stuck inside here, and this is the main living space that's there at the center. Yeah. Sorry, I was wrong. It's not one building I've seen two of his buildings. This is the building I have seen. This is the Romeo and Juliet apartment buildings in Stuttgart, same city as the exhibition. In this, of course, they're straightforward apartment building, but they're called Romeo and Juliet because one of them is a penis and the other one is a vagina. I'm not joking. This is Romeo and it just stands up straight, and this is Juliet. Okay, has a courtyard in between, and there's a garden in the middle, and that's connected by the street. The street has some shops and stuff like that at the back. This is the main road here. But look at the way that the forms of the buildings are. The buildings are not like the apartments in Romeo are these sort of distorted, twisted things that sent out these shooting little balconies into the sky, like that. Yeah. This is the aerial view. That's Romeo. That's Juliet at the back. I love the drawings, the colors and the crazy balconies and the material palettes. That's what's interesting was that for me. It was just the kind of playful use of color and material and form. That little triangular kind of balconies on top. There's a sort of sculptural ease around these buildings that is very nice actually. This is the staircase block with the colored kind of panels. And this is Juliet, by the way. This is the inside of Juliet. That's the courtyard of Juliet. So it's like a chawl. These are the corner details, like all the materials and the details that are all like kind of cascading against each other. Another image of that of the corner details and that swoop of that roof that actually forms that. It tells you the top of the building, but the top of the building cornice is moved out to create a sort of flourish. This is the external edge. That's Romeo on the left, and Romeo meets the ground, and Romeo doesn't meet the ground hard. Romeo meets the ground with a series of this plane that shoots outwards and has all these shops and cafes, etc. that are at the base. This is the street as it's meeting Romeo. That's a view of Romeo looking up, and that's that shop lane, garage lane. So it's not a shop lane. So it's a garage lane that connects Romeo and Juliet at the back. And they have a little space outside where they have little models of the houses. So I just picked a few photos to show you guys of that. And this is the entrance of Romeo. I like the way the kind of the surfaces cascade backwards to emphasize the entrance. No? It's not simply punched into the window. There's a whole elaborate series of tectonic details that are then forming the idea of entering the building. What happened? Oh, you lost me. Am I back? Shirish?
We can hear you. Hello. We can hear you, Rohan.
Hello.
We can hear you.
You can hear me? Can you see the screen?
Yeah, but we lost the presentation. We went to your team screen.
But can you see it now? Because I've gone
Not
back to
yet.
the screen. Okay, I'll wait a little.
Now
Anyway, it's
it's
the
there.
last building.
It's there.
But my favorite building of his, and maybe my favorite building in one of my favorite buildings, because I have too many, is this one, which is actually a classic kind of city crown. It's the Shirish. Can you hear me or not?
We can hear you.
Well, I'm getting this strange again. I know something's happening where I'm
Somebody's
constantly being.
calling you, Rohan, on Teams.
Okay, now you
Now
can
it's
see the
fine.
Berlin Philharmonic.
Yeah. Again, somebody's calling you.
I think he's partly disconnecting, but not fully.
I don't know. It seems that he's getting a call on Teams, and we are able to hear that feed.
No, the call sound is also the disconnection sound. So.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Rohan, are you there?
I'm there because something's happening. I don't know what's happening. Anyway, this is the Berlin Philharmonic. This is Potsdamer Platz. That is the Tiergarten, one of the most important, largest garden largest park actually in the city of Berlin. And Hans Scharoun gets an opportunity to build the main opera house of the city. This is the Berlin Philharmonic. And this is the plan, and it's completely crazy because there are many. I mean, it's almost impossible for me to describe this building. But I think what's more important than the plan is actually the section. You're able to see the Philharmonic Hall that is literally sitting on top like an entire volume. The base consists of all the entrances, offices, etc. You come from within and then you rise up into this hall, and these acoustics have been very, very carefully designed such that almost every single thing that is on the stage, which is at the center here, can be heard by every single part of the audience. In fact, the whole design of the auditorium is completely based on the internal acoustics necessary for that for the building. Another section through that. And from the outside, the entire building has two surfaces. The lower area is this sort of white base with these, you see the terraces, etc., that are rising up into the white base, and the entire Uparka surface has golden panels that are making those surfaces. So it's an incredible thing to see these golden panels shimmer in the Berlin light, actually, and it's this sort of sculptural piece that sits on top of this white base. Another view of the same building from another side. I'm just going to show you a few more images just because you get a sense of it. You can see from this glass space, you can look inside, and what you're seeing underneath here is the lobby of the building. That's there below. And then more images. And you have actually all of these circular windows have sometimes colored glass that have been put in them so that the inside of the space is quite dramatic, actually. Just some more images. I just had all these images, so I'll show them, I guess. And it's lovely to look at the details. Look at the way that the gray kind of all meets, how the gold never meets the ground. The gold always stays above. And then this little window above. Look at the ship-like metaphors that are moving across here. Okay, whale, not ships. It looks like some sort of animal, I think. And these golden panels that are there. This is within. This is the lobby. It's a very complex lobby. Those are the glass windows, circular windows with the red glass within them. Another view of the inside, you see the light fittings, etc. Again, a total work of art. Even the flooring, etc., has colored tiles. This is from within, from the lobby. If you look up, there are some places there are glass roofs. This is the flooring pattern with all its broken tiles of color that all form part of the total work of art. Another view of that lobby space. And this is when you rise up to get inside the main auditorium. You go up the stair, and once you get inside, which is the space, it is quite an amazing space, actually. It is cascading, it is wild, it's like sitting in the forest on these hills. You see these surfaces that are like, placed in all kinds of completely extraordinary diagonals and soundscape. I'm told I couldn't hear a concert within this space. The next time I go, I want to. It seems the sound is absolutely amazing within the volume itself. Like look at the way that the surfaces break up, open out, turn, twist, fold. So as much as it is expressing its madness on the outside, it's as sort of dynamic and craggy and mountain-like on the inside. So that is Sharoon, right? So that's actually it as far as the expressionists are concerned. I finished in an hour and I'm very impressed with myself. But I guess I could have spent a little longer on some of the other ideas then. What I find important about the expressionists is this idea of form as an expression of feeling. The idea that feelings of people, artists and architects and people, need to be echoed in the buildings and in the art and in the music and in the film that we make. That somehow art is able to connect to our deeper, more instinctual parts that haven't yet been corrupted by rational thought. That the irrational should be allowed to express itself in the world. And architects then become people who are then able to create the spaces within which these irrationals can exist. So there's a dynamism very often to the architecture. Sometimes when I think about the work of people like, these guys, Miralles, Zaha Hadid, or Frank Gehry, I really think about them. Are they really unto expressionists? What are because the logic for form making very often comes from an internal dynamic that they're trying to in many ways explode upon into their work itself, so that we are in many ways part of their great choreography of light and shadow and form. So that is I think that's it as far as the expressionists are concerned. Next year we will look at their mirror. And the interesting thing about mirrors is that there's always a bit of us in them. So we'll see a lot of German expressionists also again in that mirror. We'll be looking at what are called the new objectivists, and especially the movement that's called the Bauhaus. That's it. Stop sharing?
Yes, thanks, Rohan. This, Rohan, because we are also putting together the presentation for the third year on the surrealists, right? And I find that this period between the war, okay, I mean, surrealism also is a reaction to the First World War and the kind of destruction that the war has created. And I find that questioning of the rational during that period is it comes out in many different forms. Now that we have seen we've seen the German expressionists also emerging from that period of the war in between. Yeah. Okay.
This idea. Sorry, yes. We have the Jains. The Jains are.
The Jains go first.
The Jains go first, which is Bhakti, Arham, Kshama. I think that was it. And maybe Kashfi also, if she has something to say, can say it. The 4 Jains.
Yeah. Okay. Arham has raised his hand.
Hi, yeah. So I wanted to talk about those paintings and those artists' work which we saw which before the World War, the First World War. Those pictures of the cities and the Berlin the paintings of the cities basically. So what I thought of was that because Germany was at that time was focusing a lot on war, and it was not working on the social welfare of its people, because what we read in history was that it was planning for this world war for quite a sorry, I got a rebound. Just a minute. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
So Germany was planning for was building its arm, raising its army. So it wasn't able to put much economy into its for the social welfare of its people. So maybe the artists or the expressionists were trying to bring or try to raise awareness about what's the situation, how the city is suffering through those paintings. Maybe that's what I thought, because we were taught in history that before the even 20th century, in the late 19th century also, Germany was quite was under I think Kaiser William II, the ruler of that time, and that he was he had a very aggressive policy. So that's why I thought one. And the other thing, the horseshoe building which you showed us. So I thought that I had so I thought that it could be an example of a brutalist architecture, like so because it was built after the World War One, not two. But I know that brutalist architecture started after World War Two, but it was like the horseshoe building was like kind of those buildings where like there was like modular house like housing was brought together, and like I think the materiality was also like quite similar to those of the brutalist movements. So I just like found a similarity there. So I'm not sure it's right or wrong. Yeah, but
No,
that's all
there's not
I.
clarity. That's fine, not an issue. But I think the brutalists were a little different aesthetically for certain. I don't think they would have cared so much about making a cute courtyard. It would be far more muscular in nature. Maybe they would, I don't know. And they would have used concrete far more expressively than in the horseshoe building, maybe. Maybe, I don't know. I would say it's closer to the Amsterdam's buildings that we saw last time.
Little less decorative.
Yeah.
Little less ornate, actually, not decorative. The word is ornate. But the paintings, I thought, in many ways, the paintings of the city that you are referring to, right, Aram? Those two paintings of the cities. I mean, I feel that they were in fact celebrating Berlin as this place where everything is possible, you know. And I found that fascinating, that there is a that Berlin is also seen as this. I mean, till now we have seen Paris as this place of absolutely anything goes celebration, you know, and then Vienna, and then here's another city like Berlin, which also is pretty much in that same kind of idea of celebration. Right or wrong is a different kind of sort of question. I guess the later kind of developments in Germany, which led to the Nazi rule, I mean, would consider this to be blasphemous almost, right?
Yeah.
This kind of entertainment, okay, of impurity rather, you know. So I find that it leads to that kind of reaction. That's for sure. I mean, that's what we've seen in the history. I don't know much about the history of Germany before the sort of turn of the century. So I don't know. I mean, I know that there were efforts to consolidate German Empire in bringing the kind of and bringing the Austria, Hungary, that entire region into a larger kind of a German Empire.
Yeah. Okay. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else?
Thanks, sir.
Bhakti?
Yes. Even I would like Shama. Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Bhakti or Rod?
This is Shama.
Shama, okay, Shama.
Hi. The way Aram spoke about those paintings, even I was looking at those paintings, but I kind of have a very kind of I looked at them from a very different point of view, like the expressions that tried to bring out those subjective emotions and responses that those objects and events arouse within a person, and where they kind of bring their desire out by distortion, exaggeration, and kind of those rapid brushworks and those jarring colors. For example, in the paintings you showed, like by this the painting called "The Fate of Animals." Even before you spoke, I mean, since the painting, the Fate of Animals and the Angel of History, both of them belong from the same period. But I guess there was a lot of difference between them. Whereas the one painting by Franz Marc, I could, without before even you telling us the name of what the painting is, I could get it, how those colors, those red and orange colors showed the slaughtering of the animals. But at the same time, Paul's painting, they were just squares, and I don't know what that represented. So I think within kind of that, so yeah, so like how deep the painters goes, so that is what I kind of liked.
Okay.
Good point.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah. So I really liked the buildings you showed earlier. I liked how the architects had the guts and courage to actually build such huge, scary buildings. Like the house that was built over a graveyard. They seriously had a huge gut to build such buildings. And again, the last building you showed now recently, the Berlin Philharmonic, it was actually different from the buildings you showed earlier. It had the function form as how the function follows the form thing inside it. The
Yeah,
irregular
good point.
surfaces
Hmm.
make you
Yeah.
feel like you're actually sitting on a hill or something. The form gives a feeling of natural echo happening in an interior of the building. So, that was different from the buildings you showed earlier.
Mm. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
good point actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because yeah, the idea of rational, I didn't think of that. That actually the entire emphasis on that is actually a very functional building. At least that's the way it was described to me even when I went to a, you take one of those walks, you pay for some money and they take you for a walk in the building, and like the whole argument is there like that
Hmm.
around function. It's a nice
No, I
building.
mean,
You go.
yeah, the fact that that entire section pays so much attention to the acoustics.
Mm.
Okay, it seems that it is very much about the way the way you're going to play with sound and I mean sculpting with sound in many ways,
Mm.
and that's like pure form follows function. So you're
Yeah.
right, Bhakti,
Yeah.
you're right.
For me,
Yeah.
I find that entire kind of Indian angle damn entertaining. This
That
idea that
is.
somehow German expressionism can find its way back into Mahayana Buddhism. I find that to be very interesting. But I think at that time there must have been a lot of this because Indophilia was a big thing in Germany. Na? You had
Hmm.
Max Muller and people like that who were really curious about
Hmm.
what was happening in India. And I think maybe there's something there. I don't know. I mean, this is purely speculative.
Hmm. Okay, we have raised their hand. Kashvi is saying something. Kashvi?
Yeah. So at the starting, when you were talking about the body as a vehicle and becoming one to nature, and then we were talking that it happened around the World War phase. So I don't know. I felt it was like a phase of hypocrisy. I felt it in that way, and there was a line in a book, Kite Runner, which I find familiar with it. It was like a phase of certainty of turmoil to turmoil of uncertainty. So I kind of related the situation to this aura. And about the film that you talked about, the Wildcat one, I felt it was like the dark sides of architect, how that could be. So yeah, I thought about
Yeah.
that.
Whenever I think about that, I'm thinking about like I keep thinking about all these architects who take these terrible projects and think that they can kind of make it them better. No, कब होता है ना कि make a deal with the devil, Faust type. ऐसे मुझे लगता है बहुत सारा. Yeah, I think Fleur is asking in the chat box.
Yeah.
Did Madame Blavatsky introduce Dr. Annie Besant to India? Maybe, yeah. But
Hmm.
I think Annie Besant was also involved with the Irish Home Rule movement.
Yeah.
So I think she had a certain affinity towards the Indian Home Rule movement. So I think in 1915 she and Tilak start the Indian Home Rule movement, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I think Besant's relationship with India might have been through Theosophy. Whether that's directly through Blavatsky or not, I don't know. I mean, I read a whole biography of Blavatsky. I was so curious about this woman. I read two biographies of Blavatsky across the lockdown. And both of them kept contradicting each other. So I got very confused only. कि exactly हुआ क्या कुछ मालूम ही नहीं पड़ा. It was full of these stories. One of them was highly appreciative of Blavatsky, and the other one thought that she was a scam because a lot of people thought she was a scam. She used to say she can see spirits and she can talk to spirits, and some people say that you're a scam, and other people say, yeah, man, she really did it. So the entire kind of books, both the books, were like that. So I was like, "Acha." I just found her a very interesting character, very strange woman, very very strange woman. And Shravan says that this idea of the groups, the groups that come together, collectives. Yeah.
Yeah, not just the collectives, but like specifically the one where they had like anonymous names and stuff. Like, yeah, I want to know. I want a code name.
Yeah. That I got so excited by that. You can ask Shirish. I was telling him we should start one. Our entire idea for the Kamla Reja Memorial Lecture Series was that only.
Yeah,
Anonymous letters.
We already have the code names ready for each other.
I have a code name already. Yeah.
They're already there.
I mean, I have like several default code names. Depends on what the theme is. I can pick one.
Yeah.
Anyone else wants to say something before we get to Shravan? And I'm sure he has. Or do you have anything else to say, Shravan? Or is this it for today? That's good.
I have I have one comment and 2 small questions.
Okay, we shall get to you later then. We'll wait for the others first and then get to you, okay? If anyone else has anything to say. We shall wait. Or should we pick? Let's pick.
I wanted to ask something.
Yeah, go ahead.
Who's there?
Nainika.
Nayanika. Go ahead, Nayanika.
And then Atharva after that.
Yeah, like last time also we saw the ship, and today also we saw the horseshoe estate. So I just wanted to ask, how do they come up with such specific design for structure? Like, what is the inspiration or the thought process? Is it like they make and then say, oh, this resembles like this, or is it the initial thought that comes? But if I'll think of my project and I come up in ideas, for example, that I want to make a horseshoe type like building, so I have to give a reasonable argument of why I'm thinking of it. So that's what I just wanted to ask. What's the thought process behind it?
Very good question, actually. I have, and I think that is a question that we always have to struggle with as architects. That especially when you're studying, to be honest, not so much when you're designing. Designing is a different. When you're building reality, it's a little different. But when you begin to kind of have you need to, when we begin to speak about drawing, or when we begin to speak about architecture, we think it's necessary to justify it in the terms of language. So we have to give reasoning, logical reasoning, and all of these things. But a lot of creative and artistic work happens instinctively. It doesn't happen through language. Like when I think about how does a person compose music? A person composes music not by talking about it in the beginning, no. Or like saying, I'm putting this rhythm for that, I'll add this because of that. You're doing it because the music needs it. The form or the space or that particular work has a logic internal to it, and therefore you do it through that. Nah? That's what it happens. And I think a lot of artistic work does happen like that. It happens in the process of making, in the process of working with the form itself. That doesn't happen through a logic necessarily of language. But one of the things that has happened because of the way we conduct our studios, but just because of the fact that architecture is so expensive also, that you have to justify the spending of that money. So we tend to kind of try and couch it within often rational terms. Well, actually, maybe the logic is actually purely formal, like in a musical composition. In the musical composition, there is a rationality, but the rationality is not verbal. The rationality is musical.
Is the music itself, yeah.
Is the music it's within the music. Yeah. So like that in terms of form also. Sometimes the form itself has a logic. Sight itself has energies. People's bodies themselves have energies. Light and shadow themselves have energies. And maybe the logic is the sculpting of those. That doesn't need text necessarily to justify things. Which is why we often insist on you guys drawing, because it's in drawing itself sometimes that the argument very often can be made. You can use all kinds of mediums to arrive upon your project. So this is my sort of response to that I think, yes, there is that problem within the jury system. There is that problem within academic teaching, but it's something that we have to start moving through. Communication is important.
Yeah, I have a peculiar sort of observation about this, which is that increasingly we don't look at the building from the outside and draw it. Okay, increasingly the building is being drawn only as a resultant of functional kind of resolution. Okay. And so a lot of the discussions, very rarely do we actually talk about form. Okay, and so what is happening is that we don't have the language actually developed to talk about form. Okay,
Yeah.
so while Rohan is saying that sometimes it is the sometimes it is the work itself, and you don't need language. I'm saying that we need language, but we have not developed that language to talk about form. Okay, and so the easy sort of recourse is to actually go back to other aspects which are allowing us to validate or invalidate those forms, which is to say money, or to say climate, or to say, but we are not, we have not developed languages, and that is a problem of teaching also, that as architecture teaching, what do we actually teach? Are we teaching how to put together a building, or are we teaching how do we actually look at buildings? Okay, what are the ways in which we look at buildings? Okay, so I think somewhere there lies the tension also.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I keep thinking of Riaz. Riaz, I don't mean Riaz Taibji, a friend of ours. I mean Riaz as the way in which you learn music. That happens is that you get, like, let's say classical music. There's a structure to the piece. And then it is about kind of playing with that structure over and over again, day in and day out, until that formal imagination is deeply embedded in you as an instinct, as a way of seeing the world. The same thing I think about, learning to ride a bicycle or swimming. You can't think about it and then do it. You can't even talk about it. It has to be done. It's only when you do that actually you begin to learn things. So I think that's my own kind of take, that because it's so deeply embedded in performing the action, singing, drawing, all of these things, that I don't think one can talk about it. One needs to do it.
Yeah, the challenge, Rohan, is that architecture is a very different kind of an art form.
Yeah.
Meaning, like if you look at Luciel Kroll's work, right? Formally it is super exciting. Okay, but the process by which it is created is, he's not the only architect.
Yeah.
He's working with 400 people together in order to generate an architecture. Okay, the community, for example, and there are many such. So you will discover many such processes that are at play in creating architecture as well. And then where is the architect? Who is the architect? Are we the architects? Okay, collectively, yeah. So all those things come in question as well. So yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating question.
Atharva, you wanted to say something?
Like in the last semester and today also, we were looking at the cities and how the cities were shown in the form of paintings. So that was something very close to what we are learning in humanities, where we are reading about Louis Mumford and his idea of city as a theater. So like there can be like parallel scene where he says that the city is a theater where art, social culture, everything comes up together. So today that was something which can be seen through the drawings which were shown today. Like people were coming from the rural to the city.
Bruno Taut's idea of the city, or the paintings themselves.
Yeah.
Both I think. I think Mumford's imagination of a city as a place for culture is very close to Taut's imagination as well, where the desires of a city are represented within the crown, the city crown.
I found those some of those drawings in Taut's that book very similar to Srirangam, like like this kind of this kind of sort of inner kind of sanctum, and then outer kind of layering with multiple sort of wall transitions and things like. It reminded me of that drawing of Srirangam from the aerial view.
In his book, in that book, there are actually South Indian temples as plans, as samples of city crowns.
I think so, yeah. Sure.
Srirangam pretty much could be one of them.
Yeah, Shravan?
Okay, so I'll start with the questions, I guess. So when we talk about romanticism, did it have anything to do with the Romance languages and the culture around them? Because German, as far as I know, is not a Romance language, but we're still looking at German expressionism in that sense. No, right?
Mm. No.
Okay. Okay, and the second thing is now we've been looking at a lot of phallic architecture and architecture based around human sexuality. Now, in terms of the modern context, would that fly if you actually show that to like a client, like as a practicing architect? Like, has the culture changed around it? Has it?
Well, I
How
don't know
is
whether
it?
people. I don't know people whether when our friend was talking to his clients, he was saying that my building is a phallus. I think it was. Maybe it's a game that he was playing. Yeah, it's possible that can be things that are internal to you that need not necessarily be told to every client. Not everything needs to be explained every time.
Okay, right. That's a fair point. Yeah. And just for a clarification, when you showed us the plans, I couldn't. I was which was Romeo and which was Juliet. Like I couldn't really.
No, Romeo is the circular one. Sorry, Romeo is the Romeo. You'll find the plans online, but Romeo.
Okay.
This Juliet has a courtyard at the center, the circle, and Romeo
Ah.
doesn't. Romeo just goes up straight.
Okay, I was looking at it in a different direction then. Right. And so about, I think it was. Wait, I'm terrible with names, so I actually wrote this one down. Yeah, about Polzig's work, it kind of screamed a lot of horror to me, and like it gave that kind of Tim Burton kind of aesthetic,
Yes,
or
yes,
what Bram Stoker imagined in the, and even like
yes.
this idea of expressionism and the buildings in general break away from this normalcy, and like horror does the same thing with like the Addams Family and Nightmare Before Christmas kind of aesthetic. So I thought it was
Yeah.
very interesting, like how well it works with horror. Like even Picasso's work, like if you look at them in a context of horror.
Yeah, I find
Like,
I like the horror connection because horror. I used to hate horror films until I realized that they are probably the most interesting genre because they are actually about everything that is repressed and that is allowed then to kind of come out. I think that's why even the surrealists used to work with fear and danger, scary things. No? I think that's quite nice. I think rather than everything being safe and sweet. What Tim Burton does, of course, is that he keeps contrasting this. He actually finds the dark in the sweet. No? He goes to Edward Scissorhands. He will go to kind of classic suburban America, which is supposed to be extremely harmless, and then insert darkness in there. Or even with Beetlejuice, he does the same thing.
Even the themes in Batman, like Batman has been a grittier superhero in the past, but the way he kind of brings out this different kind of edge. I mean, sure, his movies haven't gone down as the best in, like,
Yeah, the
haven't really.
best. The Tim Burton Batman films, the first two are the best Batman films.
Yeah, the first two are great. I think the next was Joel Schumacher. Then Batman and Robin wasn't him, I think. Yeah.
Wasn't it?
Yeah.
Anyone else wants to talk Batman?
Yeah,
I mean, I can
Batman
always
is
talk
the
more
greatest
Batman.
superhero. And not Superman, yes.
But there's an interesting duality between them, like this kind of the.
We are not discussing Batman and Superman anymore. Okay? That's like one rabbit hole there. We can discuss it forever. And I'll get into my pet peeve against DC films, so don't need to go there right now. But I think it's interesting to think about this idea of form and expressionism and the idea that somewhere we believe that it's the role of the artist to express herself. Okay. Now, I don't see why that artist has to express herself. I don't know why architects, especially in the modern era, why architecture has to express an individual artist's identity. I don't see the reason, actually. If I think about the 19th century, that wasn't the case. It's a 20th century invention. This idea that I am an individual author and I have an expression and I'm an individual with a different identity. Fine, I agree, you have a different identity. Why? What makes you think that you have the audacity to throw it on other people's faces and lives? No, that's a good question to ask. Hota kaun hai tu? Why should I live in your mind? So that kind of is a kind of complicated question, I think, for us modern people today, who are always in many ways really trying to find our own individualistic voices. And when it comes to architecture, the question of the individual voice is a little kind of, I mean, I don't know whether it can be fairly arrogant at one level, and at the other level, it can also very easily tie into this idea of copyright and kind of capitalism's insistence on originality and a constant new fashion every 10 years. So because every 10 years then a new voice emerges, so, and a new hero emerges. So you have this entire hero architect cult that also emerges because of this very tendency that we have as modernists to imagine that there is a particular brand of people called artists with a capital A, in this case architects with a capital A, who have authorial individuality that we need to respect. And it's their individual amazing visions that they have the authority to make and to force us to consume. That I think would be an interesting thing to kind of really think about. The idea of individual expressionism.
Okay. I think the first years are going to